Hi, I'm Wendy Schoen on behalf of the Smocking Arts Guild of America. I'm here to show you shadow work embroidery by geometric association. Okay, so we're going to break it down into two parts. The first part will be demonstrating the shapes, and the second part will be actually showing you how to implement it. So now we're going to start with a straight line. It's important to know that the stitch in itself is super simple. It's just a simple back stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how I tie on. First I start with a waist knot. I'm just going to do a simple smocker's knot, pull the thread down, and when I'm tying on, I use a method of the split back stitch, and that way we don't have any knots on the back of our work. So I'm going to bring the knot down, usually in line with the first stitch, and you'll understand why when I bring it through. I'm going to come up, remember it's a back stitch, so I have to go away and back towards me with the stitch. I'm going to come up on the design line, straighten out the thread and hold it below, and then come back and actually pierce the thread beneath the fabric. Okay, so that's actually the tie-on stitch. And then just to make it look like all the other stitches, I'm going to come up just one fabric thread above, and then I'm going to make my normal stitch length. Of course, I'm working with large thread, so you can see it, but normally this would be very fine thread and also very small stitches, about a 32nd or a little bit more than that of an inch. I'm going to go ahead and place my needle above the first stitch in line with the next stitch. Now these stitches are connected stitch to stitch, sharing a common hole, and make sure that you get it without splitting the fabric in between. And this proceeds all the way up the line, and that's how the stitches work. So you see how simple that is? Okay, so now the other thing is we're going to have to do it on two different boundaries. So I'll bring you to the next step. So here we have two parallel lines. They're straight lines, so that's a good way to get started. I'm going to pretend I've already tried on, so I'm just going to do a regular stitch, a back stitch. So now the next thing I want to do is I need to go to the opposite end of this wall, or the opposite wall. That's what I call it usually. I'm going to bring it up, and I'm going to stitch another back stitch. Okay, and now what I want to do is go back to my original starting place and do the next stitch. The stitch is going to progress from side to side with each additional stitch connected to the previous stitch on the other side, or the opposite side. So we're stitching a back stitch simultaneously as we alter from side to side. All right. So now let me go ahead and explain how we turn this into different shapes. I'm going to start by using my geometric association. This particular shape is the most recognizable shape in shadow work embroidery. It begins with a V and ends with a V, and I call this the V configuration. It's also a good place to find your starting spot, and when you do that, you want to find that little V if you can find it, and on this one you absolutely can. So I'm going to begin with the waist knot like we did before. I already have one made. As you see over here, I've placed my knot strategically, so I'm going to draw an imaginary line in line with the first stitch and emerge and actually pierce the fabric. Tie on with your split back stitch. Remember, we're just going to pretend like we've done that stitch already, and go down at the point. The other stitch, or the other wall, needs to have adjoining points. The V is then, therefore, the two stitches are joined together by a common hole at the bottom. This begins my side-to-side work of stitching the shape, the open shape, or bringing it together. As I do this, and I work a true back stitch, make sure you're doing a back stitch. Don't come out of the hole and go forward. You always want to go backward. As I do this, you can see there becomes this shadowing effect. I want to turn this over so you can see well. All right, so this is what is actually happening beneath the fabric. You definitely want this hexagon shape or this side to side, actually procession up the shape. And then when you get to the top, we're just going to close it off by stitching these two shapes together at the end. And they don't necessarily need to be exactly meeting at the same time. As long as you keep going from side to side, you'll never run out of space, because if you actually get to the top and there's a little space left over, just fill it in with a back stitch. You'll be fine. All right, so the next shape is the V. Now the V is a little different than the diamond. It does not end with a point at the top. It ends with a flat line. So one of the rules I follow when I'm using this technique is whenever you have a flat line or a straight line, you no longer need to stitch from side to side. There's only a few things you need to check. Very few of your shapes will actually end evenly. So I like to think of this as my continuing wall on either side. So now what I will need to do is turn it over to check to make sure I have enough thread coverage on the back, which I think I will, yes. I need only to do one more crossover stitch to fill in this little open area. And then you'll see what happens. I'm on the right. So I want to go to the left and continue to stitch from side to side. And when I go over here, it's really a redundant stitch. So I'm just going to go back and fill in that line. There's no longer a need to stitch from side to side. I may not be catching the hole or the opening exactly, but when you do your work, you make sure you do that, because you don't want any fabric threads in between the stitches. And as I work across, if you turn it around, you'll see I have appropriate thread covering on the back, and I have the correct stitch on the front. This will end when I get to this point. So here's an example of an isosceles triangle. The interesting part about this is that you will definitely not end up on the same at the same time on those edges. I'm going to start in my V. There's my V configuration. And as I progress, I'm going to make my V corner here, but I'm going to use that leftover edge as my right wall. And lefties, it doesn't matter which side you start on, it's still the same stitch. And this is what it looks like on the back. Now, we haven't talked about tying off, so I want to mention that. When I get to the top, I just slide my needle slightly down towards the edge of the shape, never down the center, because you will be able to see that stitch on the front or on the right side. So just continue with it on the edge, and there's no need for any knots. Okay, so here is another shape, and this shape is the perfect example of when you don't continue to stitch from side to side. So as we talked about before, the stitching continues all the way across from side to side until we run out of space, and then of course the only thing we need to do is to fill in that remaining edge with back stitches. Now, I like to tell my students that when you are working these shapes, you concentrate on only that section. You don't think about the other sections that might be interconnected to that shape. You just keep to one shape, and that's my rectangle. All right, here is a shape where there is not an easy distinguishable place to start. You have to create one. So if you look at the circle, and this is actually the shape you're going to encounter the most, so it's important to note that you're going to have to establish a side to side here. So I will start by lining in my first row of stitches here in a straight path until I need to stitch from side to side. Okay, so I'm going to actually have to turn the hoop. Now I do this because, remember, I want my tie-on stitch to be in line with my first stitch. So this is going to be my tie-on space. And so think of your work as a wheel that you can spin according to how and what direction you need to approach the shape. So that's why I turned it this way. And I'm going to come up from above, or below rather, and I'm going to make my first back stitch. Remember, it's a split stitch. We're just going to eliminate that for time's sake. And then stitch continuously along the bottom line. It's still a straight line at this point. It's only when it starts to curve that we need to start our side-to-side progression. So after this stitch, pretty much need a stitch over here. So now I want to turn it back. You always want to sew a true back stitch, which means away and back. If you keep the hoop this way, you will get confused, or you will start doing a forward stitch and you won't have your hexagon or your half stitches on the back. So this was my last spot, my last stitch rather, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to do my next stitch. If you're not sure whether it's time to start side-by-side stitching, you only need to turn it around and give it a little test. In other words, I'm over now to the back. Bring the thread across and see if you need a stitch. You see, I can kind of envision I do need a crossover stitch. So therefore, I'm going to put one in. It's actually better to have too many crossover stitches than not enough straight stitches. So use that as your guideline and then just continue up the shape. Now, here's what happens when you get to the top of a circle or an oval. What happens is now I'm running out of the need or the necessity for having to do crossover stitches. So I might need only one more. I'll place this stitch, turn it around, check to see if you have enough threads in the back, and I can tell you right now I'm going to need that one there. So I'm going to bring it to the front again and do another crossover stitch. In order to check where your last stitch was, you get confused. So do a little tug so you know it's on the other side, your right side, and therefore you need to place your stitch on the left. All right, so as I'm working along, I'm just going to have some back stitches now to fill in. Fill in that stitch, and then I'm going to continue on. Now, here's where it gets a little more complicated. We'll park the needle, move on. This is called a stitch that actually is one stitch and then begins to split off into two different stitches or more sections or more. So I like to use my inverted point as my balancing point. In other words, that's the determining shape, spot for knowing when I want to stop going from this edge to that edge and then break off from this edge to that edge. So I'm going to turn my work around again so I can see. So it looks like I need one more stitch because there is my crossover point. So I'm going to go back on this side, do my crossover stitch, complete the first stitch of course, take it to the other side, and then I'm going to stop. Do a double check. Don't ever take it for granted that you have enough. You want to check. Yes, that's good. All right. So now I'm going to stitch to the nearest wall, which happens to be this wall here. I'm going to complete this section entirely. Take it to here, stitch to here, back over. And it looks like I can probably fit 2 short stitches there, but I need to do my test, so I'm going to turn it over. And yes, I am done with my crossover stitches. You see, that one is not necessary. So I'm going to just turn my work, and let's just pop 2 of them in there because a big long stitch isn't going to look good, even though these are a little bit shorter than the others. Now, after I get to the end here, I need to work the other arch. So how do I do that? I'm just going to bring it to the back, slide my needle over to my starting point over here, just to keep it neat on the back. Then I'm going to begin on this side,
this is another V. It's an inverted V, but you know you have to share the common point there, or the common opening. And then I can start my side to side progression stitching. Okay, so you might have noticed I did not allow for shortening and lengthening stitches. With this technique, you don't need to. If you think of your shape as a continuous wall, you will never run out of spaces to put a stitch. You'll always have a left and a right, and that's how you would work out your design. Okay, so here's the last one I want to show you for this section, this part rather. This one represents a shape that I do have to. It's the only exception to the rule because it's a donut shape, or it's a shape that actually moves. Notice that the inside stitches are much shorter than the outside stitches. That is how I maneuver around. I want to make sure that the stitches start to travel as I go along. Let me show you what the back looks like. So you see, I've actually made them all line up as I work around. I don't want any piling up, so you have to make allowances for that by either shortening at the top or lengthening at the outer edge. However, my suggestion is to make the ones on the inside shorter, a little bit shorter than normal, and the ones on the outside a little bit longer. Therefore, you don't have any obvious turns or missing threads. When you get back up to the top, you're going to close it in just like you started. You're going to perhaps only need to put your straight stitches in a row rather than using your crossover stitches. Remember, this is my right wall now. I'm going to put a stitch there. And then cross over. This completes the left side, of course, but not the right. So I'm going to go across, fill in my last crossover stitch. I know I need one, but I'm going to show you. As you can see that opening? You need to close that in. That's why I'm going to do one last crossover stitch. And I'm going to put 2 in there because, like I said, it's better to put 2 small stitches than one big, long, loose stitch. Make sure your V's meet with the same hole, or your corners rather. I hope you can see that. All right. So now I haven't really demonstrated how I tie off, so I'm going to do that now. Okay, so if you look, you see there's a heavy concentration of stitches here. That's the perfect spot. So now I'm just going to bring it through. You don't pick up any fabric, just pick up the threads. And you can do this in 2 steps if you want. If you don't think it's secure enough, just do another one. Don't go around the fabric this way. You want to make those tie-off stitches as invisible as possible. And then when you get to there, all I need to do is snip that off and snip this off. You can go ahead and snip it close to there because you know you did a split back stitch. That is your actual tie-on point. This is just to hold the knot in place.
So I really hope you have the opportunity to try shadow work. You're going to love it. And we'll see you next time.